Okay, so these two guys, Billy Bailey and Mike McCluskey, were beefing over in Newton, Kansas back in 1871. And unfortunately, what started off as a mere fist fight turned deadly when McCluskey gunned Bailey down. Okay, we'll skip ahead a week later, and Bailey's friend showed up there in Newton looking to set things straight, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, led to even more gunplay, as several men inside of the dance hall began opening fire. But it's what happened next that makes this really one of the craziest Old West gunfights of all time. No sooner did that first shot ring out than a mysterious teenager, known only as Riley, barred the door from the inside, pulled out his own revolvers, and began dealing death. Moments later, there were 7 men lying on the floor. Riley simply walked out and disappeared completely off the face of the earth. Who was this guy? Well, stick around and you might just find out. We're also going to discuss another gunfight that took place in El Paso between a couple of soiled doves, Big Alice Abbot versus Etta the Grasshopper, or as I like to call it, the Battle of the Bordellos. Spoiler alert, someone's going to get shot in their nether regions. And finally, we'll close things out by examining the big fight over at Jenkins Saloon in the now ghost town of Tascosa, Texas. And yeah, that means we'll also be talking about such colorful characters as Catfish Johnny, Poker Tom, and Squirrel-Eyed Charlie. So without further ado, my name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
There's 2 things you just don't discuss in a beer joint: politics and religion. Reason being, these topics tend to be a bit divisive. You add alcohol to the mix and things could get downright ugly, as was the case one sweltering August evening in Newton, Kansas, 1871. 2 kind of sort of lawmen by the names of Mike McCluskey and Billy Bailey got into a heated argument over you-know-what, politics. One thing led to another, and the pair took to throwing hands. Wasn't long before both men tumbled out of the Red Front Saloon and commenced the fighting right there in the thoroughfare. By this point, the Ohio-born McCluskey, a former night watchman for the railroad, had the upper hand on Bailey. And, well, I guess he decided to keep it that way. Not leaving anything up to chance, McCluskey pulled his revolver and fired twice, one of the rounds striking Billy in the chest. The wounded man lingered, but not for long. The following day, Bill Bailey would make his final pilgrimage through death's door. We'll likely never know the specifics as what Mike and Bill were arguing about, and I guess it doesn't really matter. Just one of the countless drunken saloon killings that took place across the American frontier in the latter part of the 19th century. But what makes this fight so interesting is what would follow. A quest for revenge that led to one of the deadliest and most mysterious gunfights of the Old West. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. For a very brief period, Newton, Kansas was the end of the Chisholm Trail for the cattle herds coming up out of Texas, and the town seemed to pop up nearly overnight. There's a story of someone passing through Newton in May of 71 and only seeing a couple of buildings. The first train would arrive in July, and by late summer, it was a regular boomtown. Now, this was before the Santa Fe line made its way to Wichita, and seeing as how Newton was a good 60 or so miles closer to Texas than Abilene was, it soon became the destination of choice for the trail bosses. Now, the 2 men I mentioned earlier, McCluskey and Bailey, they were these so-called special policemen, hired by the railroad to help keep the peace during a very contentious election taking place that very August there in Newton. And I was unable to find out the exact details of said election, other than it had some to do with the railroad or a bond of some sort. Remember, since Newton was a cow town, their entire economy was built around being a hub for the Santa Fe Rail. And this brought a lot of money to the town, especially in the form of all them buckaroos coming up out of Texas who would be more than ready to spend some of their hard-earned money once they sold off their beeves. And one of these young cowpokes was a man by the name of Hugh Anderson, who, unfortunately for Mike McCluskey, considered the recently departed Billy Bailey to be a friend. According to at least one source, the 2 men were possibly related through Hugh's mama's side of the family. Whatever the connection, Mr. Anderson was outraged to learn that Bailey had been gunned down like a dog in the street. And, well, he decided to even up the score. Speaking of McCluskey, as soon as he terminated Bailey, he got to worrying about having his neck stretched, so he skedaddled. Not for long, though. Once he was assured that the killing would most likely be considered justifiable, he returned. Rumor has it that Billy Bailey had previously killed a couple of guys in various gunfights, so I guess all Mike had to say was that he feared for his life. A defense that, while it may have worked in the court of law, would fall on deaf ears when it came to the Texas cowboy, Hugh Anderson. He and his friends went hunting McCluskey, and they found him, along with a buddy of his named Jim Martin, in a saloon playing cards. Tuttle's Dance Hall it were, located in what passed for the red light district there in Newton, an area the locals called Hyde Park. And the men in question, those friends of Hugh Anderson, were none other than Jesse Woodson James, Leroy Butch Cassidy, and Paul G.D. Bunyan. And brother, they was looking for blood. And no, that last part is absolutely not true. The actual names of Anderson's friends are names you've probably never heard before. Henry Curries, Jim Wilkerson, and Billy Garrett. Together with Hugh, they were just four wild-eyed young cowboys. A few of the legion that trailed cattle from Texas to Kansas back in them days. And if it weren't for the events I'm about to describe, it's very likely that all of these men, McCluskey and Anderson included, would be all but forgotten to history, except for maybe appearing on someone's Ancestry.com tree. However, that's not to say they were just a bunch of nobodies. Billy Garrett, in particular, was said to have already come out on top in a couple of shooting scrapes. And Hugh Anderson weren't no slouch either. The son of a rancher, Anderson had very recently rode with none other than John Wesley Hardin in pursuit of a wanted killer. And take this next part with a grain of salt, as I was not able to verify it, but there is a possibility that Hugh and his older brother had been participants in the Sutton-Taylor feud. What's for certain is that Anderson wasted no time in confronting Mike McCluskey, and he did not mince words when doing so. Called Mike a cowardly son of a bitch to his face and said he was going to blow his dang head off. And this weren't no idle threat either. No sooner were the words out of Hugh's mouth when he cleared leather. But let's just back up for a sec. Remember, this dance hall wouldn't have exactly been empty of civilians when all this went down. There would have been other customers, likely other cowboys looking to blow off some steam, wet their whistles, and hopefully their carrots. You would have had dance hall employees, a bartender or two, probably a few working gals, maybe even a faro dealer, in addition to just a few random citizens of Newton who decided to have a nightcap before calling it a day. But I don't know any of their names. The only other name that I can give you that was there at Tuttle's Dance Hall at this very crucial point when Hugh Anderson threw down was a teenager by the name of Riley. A lunger he was, had tuberculosis. By all accounts, it wasn't looking good. Now, this kid is somewhat of a mystery. Scratch that. He's a huge mystery. Nobody seems to know where he came from, and he doesn't appear to have any family or anything like that. Matter of fact, the only thing that Riley did have was a friend, one solitary friend in the whole wide world, a man who had previously been kind to him. And that man was Mike McCluskey. Now, what Mike did to garner the undying loyalty of this Riley character, I have no idea. A few sources will tell you that McCluskey taught the youngster how to handle a firearm, or that he was simply nice to him when others weren't. Whatever the cause, the kid soon became known as McCluskey's shadow. Okay, now we've got all the pieces in place, right? Hopefully you've kind of got an idea of the situation. Hugh Anderson and his pals come hunting for McCluskey looking to get even and find him in a dance hall with Jim Martin, and somewhere nearby was the shadow Riley. Anderson quickly threatens McCluskey and unholsters his revolver, and what follows is one of the deadliest gunfights of the Old West. Upon seeing the brandished revolver, Jim Martin jumped to his feet and tried to defuse the situation, but it was just too late. Anderson's pistol barked, and Mike McCluskey took a round to the side of the neck. Still, though, the wounded man was able to pull his own iron, which misfired. Damn it. Mike drops to the floor, and Anderson closes in and pumps several more rounds straight into McCluskey's back. By this point, all hell had broken loose. Hugh's buddies, the aforementioned Garrett, Kearns, and Wilkerson, they started firing as well, at whom we do not know. One theory is that they opened up just to simply keep the crowd at bay. Likely they couldn't even see what they were shooting at due to all the gun smoke. And they almost certainly had no idea that their most immediate threat lay nearby in the form of a sickly and emaciated teenager who had just witnessed the only friend he had gunned down right before his eyes. Now, there's a dramatic version of the story that says Riley then calmly walked to the saloon door and barred it shut for the inside, so as not to allow anyone to escape. Sort of like that scene in that movie, The Bronx Tale, if you've ever seen it. You know the one. Now you can't leave. And I personally don't believe Riley locked the door, though. It's a bit, theatrical. But what I do think happened, what most people, even historians, agree on, is that as soon as Mike McCluskey was gunned down, this young Riley produced 2 revolvers of his own and commenced to deal in death. His bullets ripped into Anderson, all of Anderson's friends, and whoever else got the damn way. Even McCluskey's other pal Jim took a fatal round to the throat. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 men would lay dead or dying. As for Riley, well, he simply lowered his guns and stepped out into the street, never to be seen again. Whew, gives me chills just thinking about it. This whole bloody ordeal probably lasted less than 90 seconds, if that. and some unknown teenager just dropped more men in one gunfight than any of your more well-known and celebrated gunmen. Which begs the question, who the hell was this Riley kid? Seriously, nobody knows where he came from or where he went. He just flat out disappeared. And like I said, 8 men were shot. Jim Martin, Garrett, an innocent railroad man who took a bullet to the gut, and Mike McCluskey were all dead. Anderson was shot twice in the legs, and his buddies Kearns and Wilkerson were wounded as well, along with another innocent bystander. And each one of these casualties were due to the lethal guns of Riley, except for Mike McCluskey, of course. As for Anderson, he would survive his wounds, but he was facing serious legal troubles. A warrant was issued for his arrest on account of gunning down McCluskey, but Hugh was snuck out of town and back into the safe beckoning arms of the Lone Star State before he could be brought to justice. And like I said, Riley just disappeared. And that, in a nutshell, is the shootout at Hyde Park, also known as the Newton Massacre. But trust me, the story is far from over. Look, if you're like me, then you were probably at least a little familiar with this fight already. I mean, I've been reading some version of it for as long as I can remember. And for the most part, the story is pretty consistent, and it's pretty similar to what I just described, especially with the strong emphasis on this young man, Riley. I always wondered, though, could there be more to the tale? What would I find if I dug just a little deeper? Luckily, I was not disappointed. I also didn't have to go digging all that deep. Turns out somebody had done quite a bit of research on our behalf, and that someone is a lady named Christine Schmucker, the curator for the Harvey County Historical Museum there in Newton. More on Chris later. I just wanted to point out that her work was phenomenal. But first, let's address the fake elephant in the room. You go ahead and Google the Newton Massacre or the shootout at Hyde Park, and you're sure to find another exciting tale of revenge. One that would take place a couple of years after the gunplay I just described. Story goes that Mike McCluskey had a brother. And if there's one thing brothers don't care for, it's someone else murdering their sibling. I got a brother too, okay? And if he needs killing, I'll be the one to do it. Allegedly. Not some rando. And I reckon Mike's brother Arthur felt the same way. Remember, Hugh Anderson was safely whisked back to Texas following that shootout. But according to this version of events I'm about to recount, he would soon find himself back in Kansas, Medicine Lodge to be exact, working as a bartender. And as soon as Arthur McCluskey found out, he sent an emissary on over to formally invite Anderson to a duel. Yeah, a proper duel. This wasn't going to be no wild free-for-all like the one Mike died in, or Billy Bailey for that matter. No, this would be a stand-in-the-street affair with rules and such. Anderson was even given a choice, pistols or knives, and he chose pistols. I can't blame him there. Both men stood back to back, walked several paces away, and then, at the signal of a pistol shot, whirled and began firing at each other. And both men drew blood. Matter of fact, they both emptied their damn revolvers. And although both were horribly wounded, neither one was willing to call it quits. According to one dubious reporter who claimed to have witnessed the fight, quote, McCluskey, summoning by a supreme effort his remaining strength, drew his knife and began to crawl feebly in the direction of his antagonist. The latter, who had raised himself to a sitting position, saw the movement and prepared to meet it, end quote. What followed was a good old hack fest with the gruesome duo slicing and stabbing until finally, with the last flicker of a blade, both Hugh Anderson and Art McCluskey lay still in the street, deader in hell. At least, to quote Mike Rowe, that's the way I heard it. Kind of. I mean, there are a few sources that are willing to admit that maybe Hugh Anderson actually survived his wounds and once again returned to Texas and lived to be an old man. And they admit that because, well, it's true. And we know it's true because there's one hell of a clear paper trail when it comes to Hugh Anderson. Listen, I love a good fight to the death as much as the next man, believe me. But here at the Wild West Extravaganza, we try to focus on true tales from the wild and woolly West. As such, I do at least attempt to separate fact from fiction when I can. And it turns out this is one situation where I definitely can do so. Once again, largely due to the research of Christine Schmucker, who we'll get to later. As far as that fatal duel there at Medicine Lodge, there's one source and one source only. And that source is a shady AF news correspondent that went by the alias of Allegro. Yes, Allegro. Sounds like some sort of over-the-counter allergy medication or something. Common side effects of Allegro include nausea, diarrhea, upset stomach, muscle or back discomfort or pain, sleepiness, drowsiness, erectile dysfunction, anal bleeding, anal fissures, anal warts, anal anything, a propensity to listen to horrible podcasts. Please consult your physician. You get the drift. And when it comes to this Allegro guy, let me tell you, the dude knew how to spin a tale. He had also reported on the gunfight at Hyde Park back in 1871, and he was the one that dubbed Riley as the avenging nemesis. Matter of fact, let me read you that passage so you can get an idea of what sort of flair that this Allegro guy wrote with. In August of 1871, very shortly after the actual gunfight at Newton, he wrote, quote, "There is an avenging nemesis on track. A stalwart figure suddenly appears on the scene. For an instant, he remains motionless, as if studying the situation. Then a sheet of flame vomits forth, apparently from his hand, and a Texan staggers from the room across the area and falls dead at the door of the Alamo. Another and another and another shot follows until 6 men have bowed to his prowess." End quote. So here's the deal. This Allegro, in addition to being a correspondent to various newspapers, also made a living as a fiddle player there in Kansas dance halls. At least he did before getting run out of the territory. He would soon, however, continue to write salacious stories for a rag dubbed the New York World, but even they got tired of him, fired him and doxed him, saying that his true identity was, quote, "a shyster named E.J. Harrington, who was utterly unworthy of confidence and continence and belonged in the penitentiary," end quote. And it is this man, this quote-unquote shyster, who is our only source when it comes to the duel at Medicine Lodge. Now, before you get to, "but Josh," and me, it's not just this bad reputation of Allegro, who was also referred, by the way, in the Newton papers as a deadbeat, that makes me question the validity of the duel. Now, some people point to the location of this alleged fight as being proof positive that the story was fake. Allegro says it took place in Medicine Lodge, which he described as being, quote, "in the very heart of the Indian Nation, about 100 miles south of the Kansas frontier," end quote. Now, you and me know that Medicine Lodge was, in fact, in Kansas and not in the Indian Nation or Indian Territory, but I am of the opinion that this could possibly be explained away just by the awkward phrasing. To a greenhorn like Allegro, everything outside of the city limits there in Kansas was the Indian Nation. And I mean, in one sense, he could be right. You know, you had a lot of Arapaho and Southern Cheyenne, Kiowa, and even your occasional Comanche out there. Furthermore, the town of Medicine Lodge, which was founded in 1873, the year the duel allegedly took place, was only 25 miles north of official Indian territory, and coincidentally about 100 miles southwest of Newton. So Allegro's description of being 100 miles south of the Kansas frontier can easily be explained, in my opinion. Now, the main issue with this story, to me, is that there's zero corroboration. Allegro claimed that he and about 70 others witnessed McCluskey and Anderson fight to the death. Yet there's no proof that anyone anywhere at this time nor in the years that followed ever mentioned it. Matter of fact, the local papers there in Kansas were already calling the story a lie almost as soon as it was printed. And furthermore, we know the ultimate outcome of the duel, the death of Hugh Anderson, is absolutely not true. Here's where the paper trail comes into play that I mentioned earlier. You know, thanks to census and marriage records, as well as family recollections, we've got a pretty good general overview of Anderson's entire life. He was born in November of 1851, by the way, so he was still just 19 years old when he threw down on Mike McCluskey there in that dance hall. Rash and full of piss and vinegar and probably thinking he could live forever, just like 1,000 other young men you can still find to this day in dance halls scattered from Houston to Midland, full of fake courage and meanness, especially come payday. Not to say that Anderson wasn't from tough stock. As I mentioned previously, his daddy was a rancher and veteran of the Civil War, having served in the Shiloh Home Guard in DeWitt County. And as I previously teased, the family may have been involved in the Sutton-Taylor feud. And while I could find no solid proof of that, I did find some pretty good evidence that our young Hugh Anderson did in fact know John Wesley Hardin. Now that's an interesting story all on its own. In early July of 1871, a vaquero by the name of Juan Badena shot and killed Billy Coran, trail boss. This led some wealthy cattlemen to recruit none other than the notorious Wes Hardin to track this Badena character down. According to the book 10 Deadly Texans, Hardin ran into Billy's brother John as well as a young cowboy named, you guessed it, Hugh Anderson. And together this bunch was able to locate Mr. Juan Badena at Sumner City, about 60 miles south of Newton, on July 7th. And once located, John Wesley Hardin's pistols fired and another Juan bit the dust. Get it? Another Juan? One? Whatever. Anyway, the gunfight there at Hyde Park would occur just about a month and a half later. And it does seem that this may have been Hugh Anderson's scared straight moment. Remember, he was still a teenager himself. That's another weird angle to this whole story. There's so much emphasis placed on the youth of Riley, who we're going to get to in a minute, but many of the sources I've seen list Riley as being 18 years old. However, when it comes to Hugh Anderson, we automatically imagine a grown man with plenty of experience under his belt. And that could not be further from the truth. And yeah, John Wesley Hardin would have only been about 18 years old himself in 1871, but I do think he was just built different. Some men, most men, don't have the stomach for such deadly action. PTSD is real, and most of us just want to live our lives peacefully. Hardin, however, was a bit of an anomaly. A pure killer who didn't seem to fear death nor have any respect for the sanctity of life. He'd continue his violent ways for the next 20 years, whereas Anderson seemed to steer clear of trouble after gunning down McCluskey. Once back in Texas, Hugh would get married at the young age of 20 after recuperating from his wounds. And his first son was born in 1873, the same year when he was supposed to be up there in Kansas fighting Art McCluskey to the death. By the way, I'm no detective, but I would like to point out that I was not able to find an Arthur McCluskey anywhere near Kansas in the 1860s, 70s, or 80s. Now take that for what it is. I'm not saying it's definitive proof that the man didn't exist, but I am saying that the proof isn't readily available for a dummy like me to find. Back to Hugh Anderson. His wife would die sometime in the 1870s, and by 1880, the widower is living in McCulloch County, Texas, working as a stock raiser, a career he would continue even after his second marriage in 1884, as he and his new bride relocated to New Mexico. Couple would have 2 daughters, but unfortunately, Hugh Anderson would find himself a 2-time widower by the year 1900. A decade later, in 1910, Hugh is still alive and well there in New Mexico, now living with his grown son Oscar and his family, and still working as a stockman. In mid-June of 1914, old Hugh, now 60-something years old, took refuge under a tree during a rainstorm. The tree was struck by lightning, and that was the end of Hugh Anderson, who the local paper dubbed a well-known cattleman. He's buried over in Tenney, New Mexico, by the way, just outside of Lincoln. And as far as anybody knows, he never once mentioned no duel up in Medicine Lodge. Hugh's younger brother Wyatt, who lived all the way up to 1948, would later describe that cattle drive that took place back in 1871. Now, Wyatt would have only been 5 or 6 at the time, but he does confirm hearing that Hugh did kill a man in Kansas that summer, and that their older brother, Richmond, also had a couple of killing scrapes, one in Texas and one in Kansas. And yeah, just like his brother, Wyatt Anderson likewise never mentioned any second duel with Arthur McCluskey. I think it's safe to say that that duel never happened. Not only was the man who penned the original article an untrustworthy source, but there's also zero evidence, and you gotta have evidence. As far as the mysterious Riley goes, oh boy, where to start? Look, your guess is as good as mine. The biggest question I initially had was whether or not Riley even existed. I mean, there are some obvious holes in the story, right? There was a coroner's jury formed following the shootout to determine whether or not Hugh Anderson murdered Mike McCluskey, and shortly thereafter, a warrant was issued for Anderson's arrest. And it turned out to be quite the exciting affair. Remember, young Hugh Anderson wasn't in town alone. He was with a group of half-wild cowpokes who weren't too happy about the findings of that coroner's jury. Matter of fact, they promised that bodies would soon be hanging like ornaments from telegraph poles if Hugh was arrested. Anderson's father, Walter, then 50 years old, wasted no time in getting to Newton and not only securing the best medical care for his boy, but also appealing to the business leaders there in town to help get his son out. For their part, they wanted to avoid any additional bloodshed, so a plan was soon concocted to spirit the wounded cowboy out in the dark of night. The excitement was intense, recalled Newton resident Judge Robert W.P. Muse, going on to say, quote, and the city marshal Tom Carson and his assistants, all heavily armed, were parading the streets day and night with warrants for the arrest of Anderson, end quote. Once the local sawbones decided that Hugh could be safely moved, and with the help of the aforementioned judge, the young man was placed on a train at about 2 a.m. Thus ends the 3rd or 4th chapter in Newton's bloody history, a town only a little over 3 months old. But if the worse than beastly prostitution of the sexes is continued and the town is controlled by characters who have no regard for virtue, decency, or honor, it will not soon become fit for the abode of respectable people, reported the Abilene Chronicle on August 24th, 1871. So yeah, there you go. A lot was written about Hugh Anderson directly following the shootout, but there's barely a mention of this mysterious shadow, Riley. The correspondent Allegro didn't even mention Riley by name. Remember? Only referring to the shooter as the quote-unquote avenging nemesis. Matter of fact, it is this Judge Muse who seems to be the first to name the kid, saying, quote, a friend of McCluskey, a boy named Riley, some 18 years of age, quiet and inoffensive in deportment, and evidently dying from consumption, end quote. He'd go on to recall that Riley was known locally as McCluskey's shadow and that he was a, quote, thin, tubercular man who followed the railroad gunman around like a little dog that barked and snapped from behind his master, end quote. Judge Muse, who, while a citizen of Newton, wasn't actually present at the dance hall on the night in question, was also the one that theorized that Riley coolly locked the door of that saloon before drawing his revolvers. A poem published a year after the incident also lists Riley by name. And this poem, penned by Theodore F. Price, reads as follows. What form strides o'er the threshold red, with weapons fiercely clenched? He looks upon McCluskey dead, with gory garments drenched. Then calmly aimed, the trigger drew. A Texan died, his aim was true. 7 gory forms before him lying. That friend was fearfully avenged. Grim Riley turned away. I don't know. You would think there would at least be more said of this Riley guy. Why was there no warrant issued for his arrest? Or if there was, why no mention of it? Nor mention of the deputies walking the streets of Newton searching for him as opposed to Anderson. There was all this excitement about Hugh leaving town in the middle of the night, and he only killed one man, whereas Riley took down several. In 1950, nearly 8 decades after the gunfight, a newspaper there in Newton quoted an unnamed prominent citizen as saying, quote, law-abiding men knew what had taken place in Tuttle's Saloon. They furnished the youth Riley with saddle and bridle. A livery stable owner gave him a pony, and he rode out of town that night and wound up in Ellsworth. Nothing more is heard of him, and it is presumed that his pulmonary disease ended his life. Skip ahead another 20 years, and in 1971, an author named William Moran wrote in his book, Santa Fe and the Chisholm Trail in Newton, that he thought Riley could have escaped town the next morning, possibly as a stowaway, and, simply changed his name. And according to another author, Mary Sandoz, she wrote in her book, The Cattleman, that there was a posse formed to look for Riley, but of course they never found him. So few details, so many questions. I suppose, though, that it's not that surprising that the good citizens of Newton would likely want Riley out of town as quickly as possible. You and me, we look back at these stories and they're exciting, right? Cowboys and gamblers and shootouts, frontier towns. But to the people living there in Newton, the majority of them were law-abiding citizens. Normal people, shopkeepers and merchants and hotel operators and barbers and stuff like that, family men. They didn't like crime any more than you and I do. We know that, according to Judge Muse, they were more than willing to help Anderson get out of town if it meant no more killing. Likely as not, they were equally as willing to sneak young Riley, if that was his name, out of town as well, probably hoping he'd never come back. And surely they would have never dreamed me and you would be talking about him 150 years later. And don't call me Shirley. But man, I sure wish I knew who Riley was. Driving me crazy. And for what it's worth, there are theories, but unfortunately none of them hold much water. One that really piqued my interest is that the young man wasn't really consumptive, and that he not only survived his escape from Newton, but lived for many, many more years, under the alias of Doc Middleton. If you're not familiar with Doc, whose real name, by the way, was Jim Riley, he was one hell of a horse thief. He was also described as being a very thin, soft-spoken man, which would line up with Judge Muse's description of the Newton Riley. Middleton was born in 1851, so his age would have fit as well. And then there's the fact that Doc wasn't afraid to resort to violence, having already killed a man by the tender age of 18, a killing that landed his ass in Huntsville prison. Now, he would eventually escape, but here's the thing, not until 1874. Our gunfight at Hyde Park took place in 1871 when Doc was still behind bars. So unless I've got my facts wrong here, I think it's safe to say that Doc Riley Middleton is not our Riley. By the way, it's thought that Doc earned that title by the way he could doctor or alter a horse's brand. I'll have to look more into Middleton one of these days. He might just be a future topic here on the Wild West Extravaganza. All right, so here's what we're left with in the end. Gunfight at Newton most certainly took place. 8 men were shot, 4 of whom died. We know Hugh Anderson opened up the ball and that it's likely his bullets that did McCluskey in. As for the mysterious shooter Riley, who the hell knows? While I don't believe that he locked the doors of the saloon, I do think there's enough evidence to conclude that he not only existed, but that he was also present and a participant in the gunfight at Hyde Park. As to how many of the wounded and dead he accounted for, as opposed to Anderson's friends who also opened up fire, I don't know. And as far as what happened to Riley after the shootout, I doubt any of us will ever know. It's my opinion that in cases like this, it's almost always the simplest answer that turns out to be true. Occam's razor, right? I tend to think that Riley probably did have tuberculosis and that he was probably already on death's door when he shoved them smoke wagons there in Tuttle's dance hall. More than likely, the young man fled town and he didn't survive another cold Kansas winter. Just another kid buried in a pauper's grave somewhere, probably under a damn Starbucks now. And once again, as far as the duel at Medicine Lodge, I think we can safely say that was a figment of Allegro's imagination. There's only one recorded telling of the story, pinned under an assumed name by an untrustworthy source. The source reported as a liar even at that time. And in the years that followed, there have absolutely been no other pieces of evidence backing up these claims. Either way, the whole ordeal is fascinating. The gunfight in Newton didn't involve anyone famous, and none of the participants could be considered as real-deal gunslingers. Yet the result was a body count higher than most of the more well-known shootouts.
Yeehaw! If you can, I want you to close your eyes and try to imagine an Old West gunfight. What are you envisioning? Two guys facing off in the middle of the street? High noon, fingers twitching at the butts of their holstered six-shooters? Maybe you're picturing a desperate fight on the prairie. The last stand as scared yet determined men dig in, counting their ammunition and vowing to sell their lives dearly. Or maybe you've got a more realistic idea. A smoky, crowded saloon as deadly drunks clear leather began blasting away at themselves and everybody else, just mere feet apart. I think it's safe to assume that whatever the scenario, you're probably just imagining men, right? And for good reason. I mean, there weren't really any female gunfighters, at least not that I'm aware of. You had your lady bandits like Belle Starr and Ann Dunn, sure, but they weren't exactly out there stacking bodies like John Wesley Hardin. Point I'm trying to make is you've probably never heard of two females squaring off against each other and resorting to gunplay, as far as the Old West goes. Well, my friend, you are in luck, because I've got one such tale for you today. A little something I like to call the Battle of the Bordellos. The cat fight at the cat house. The bout of the madams. So drop them petticoats and loosen up them corsets. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Ain't that what they say? But what happens when it's also a woman doing the scorning? And what happens if that hell is just El Paso, Texas? One hell of a cat fight, that's what. Seriously though, El Paso back in April of 1886 was most definitely still the wild, woolly West. Hell, this was almost 9 years before the aforementioned John Wesley Hardin would make the border town his home and his final resting place. In the year 1880, El Paso boasted a population of 736. A decade later, in 1890, the population had exploded to over 10,000. Of course, people had been living in the locale for much, much longer than that. Folsom points discovered in the greater El Paso region suggest at least 12,000 years of human habitation. Tribes whose names we don't even know resided there, and so did tribes that we do know about, like the Umano, and later on the Mescalero. And then the Spanish, who first visited the area way back in 1581, before establishing the village of El Paso in 1630, a village that was actually still a part of New Mexico until the 1850 compromise. By 1859, a visitor had this to say about the village. Quote, "The Texas town of El Paso had 400 inhabitants, chiefly Mexicans. Its businessmen were Americans, but Spanish was the prevailing language. All the features were Mexican. Low and flat adobe buildings, shady cottonwoods under which dusky, smoky women with swarthy children sold fruit, vegetables, and bread. Habitual gambling universal, from the boys' game of pitching quartillas to the great saloons where huge piles of silver were staked at Monte. In this little village, $100,000 often exchanged hands in a single night through the potent agencies of Monte and poker. There were only 2 or 3 American ladies, and most of the whites kept Mexican mistresses. All goods were brought on wagons from the Gulf of Mexico and sold in an advance of 300 or 400% at Eastern prices. From hills overlooking the town, the eye takes in a charming picture. A far-stretching valley enriched with orchards, vineyards, and cornfields, through which the river traces a shining pathway. Across it appear the flat roofs and cathedral towers of the old Mexican El Paso. Still further, dim, misty mountains melt into the blue sky." End quote. My goodness. Sounds picturesque. Sadly, however, El Paso wouldn't stay a sleepy little exotic hamlet forever. The railroad would come in 1881, and with it an influx of migrants, mostly from back east. This accounts for the drastic change in population that I mentioned a minute ago.
between the years 1880 and 1890. As you can imagine, a boost in population also means a boost in crime. Wasn't long before the boomtown became known as the six-shooter capital, as violence, gambling, and prostitution flourished. By 1890, El Paso had a new nickname, the Monte Carlo of the United States, or as visiting U.S. President Benjamin Harrison called it, Sin City. And of course, El Paso, like many Western towns back in those days, was actually two separate entities. You had your respectable part of town, right, where the so-called decent people lived. That's where you'd find legitimate businesses, churches, schools, and such. Then you had the other side of town, an area that would become known as the Tenderloin District. This is where a man could find temporary love, get a good drunk on, gamble away his money, and quite possibly his life. This is also where the broken lived, the downtrodden, the unfortunate, along with those that prey on their kind. And within this Tenderloin District, you had an area known as the Utah Street Reservation. And that's where hundreds of soiled doves plied their trade. And by soiled doves, I mean working gals, prostitutes. One of which was a lady by the name of Alice Abbot, a.k.a. Big Alice, also known as Fat Alice. Now a little history lesson of El Paso that I shared with you. Alice Abbot likely didn't know anything about any of that. Probably she didn't even care. The only part that concerned her was when the railroad came to town, as it was her vessel of choice when she joined the growing population in the year 1881. Now, we don't know much about Alice. What else is new, right? She was probably born sometime in the 1840s, possibly in Louisville, Kentucky. Luckily, there is at least one picture of Big Alice, so we know what she looked like. Dark-haired and thin-lipped, with somewhat of a plump face. Alice could be best described as looking stout, like the kind of lady that could lift heavy objects, as well as heavy men. You can only tell so much from one picture, you know? Thankfully, as far as Alice is concerned, we've got plenty of eyewitness descriptions. And they've all got one thing in common. Miss Abbott was a big gal. They say she stood 6 feet tall and weighed anywhere from 190 to 230 pounds, hence the name Big or Fat Alice. Now, me personally, I kind of take issue with this. First off, how the hell did anybody know what she weighed? I highly doubt she was sharing that information with anybody. And secondly, 200 pounds on a 6 foot tall woman isn't really what I'd consider overweight. Big, yes. At a height of 6 feet tall, she likely towered over most of the men who called El Paso home. But even if she weighed 230 pounds, I don't know. I kind of feel like that doesn't really qualify as huge or anything. Healthy, maybe. Rubenesque, even. Or as I like to call it, a good time. And what if she was on the bigger side? You fellas are scared of a little bit of meat with your potatoes. Maybe you need to start taking your damn vitamins. They don't call them love handles for nothing. You know what I mean? Besides, let's be honest. The bigger the fupa, the tastier the chalupa. Okay. Full disclosure, I did find one and just one reference to Big Alice weighing in at 300 pounds, which would make more sense considering the nicknames. And judging by that one picture, 300 pounds does look more accurate than 190. However, the point still stands, I guess. You know, for the time and place, she was considered a bigger woman. Anyway, once Miss Alice Abbott showed up in El Paso, she opened up her own joint on Utah Street. Number 19 Utah Street, to be exact. By the way, Utah Street is now known as South Mesa, for any of you living in or visiting El Paso. And by joint, I do mean whorehouse. A legal whorehouse. Kind of. I mean, sure, you did have to grease the cops every now and then, in more ways than one, I'm sure. You know, most of these madams were charged a quote-unquote fine of $10 a month, just the price of doing business. And then they likely paid a little extra to keep the peace, you know, protection money. Long story short, everybody was getting paid and everybody was getting laid. But not everybody was equal. There were levels to the horror game back in the Old West, especially in places like El Paso. The bottom of the rung, you had what was called the crib girls, sort of like your modern-day streetwalkers. They advertised their goods on public thoroughfares and took clients back to their small little dens or apartments, also known as cribs. These women could be purchased for as little as 50 cents and led what could only be described as miserable lives. And I don't say that out of judgment. I say it out of pity. You know, many of them were broken, spent, used up, abused, just eking out the last of their days. Got to imagine that sex trafficking played a very large part down in the cribs. A lot of women, if not all of the women there, were there against their will. Women who oftentimes couldn't even speak the same language as the men who were buying them. Then you had the saloon girls. Think of the gals who worked at the Gym Saloon on HBO's Deadwood. Just like on the show, the saloon girls would meet their clientele in the saloon proper and then take them to the back or upstairs and trade some loving for money. Once again, we're dealing with women who oftentimes did not have a choice in what they were doing. In the real-life Deadwood, the real-life Alice Swearingen did lure these women to his saloon under false pretenses. The promises of jobs cleaning or cooking and stuff like that, only to then force them into prostitution. And if you wanted to leave, well, you did so at your own peril. Trust me, this practice ran rampant across the West. Just like the crib girls, saloon working gals were often on the losing side of beatings and abuse. Another good example for these type of ladies would be from the movie Unforgiven. Remember the ones that were working at the billiards hall for skinny? Remember how that one girl got her face cut up? I can only assume that abuse like this also ran rampant, and that there was very little done in the way of justice other than paying off her pimp. These women, simply put, were just property. Of course, you also had the more upscale establishments. Once again, I'll use Deadwood as an example. Remember Cy Tolliver and the Bella Union? Remember what he said when Al came sniffing around? We're offering different atmospheres. You're a pioneering type, trailblazing type. You're going to draw a trailblazing element. To which Swearingen replied, meaning I get the ones who don't wash. And yeah, that is kind of what it meant. The fancier the place, the cleaner the girls, the more a man could expect to spend. Especially at places like the Shea and Me. Joni Stubbs' fancy whorehouse she opened up when she broke from Tolliver. That would have been the top rung, what would be called a parlor house. And from what I can tell, that is what it appears that Fat Alice ran. A proper whorehouse or a parlor house. Only problem was she had competition directly across the street with another madam, a red-headed French-Canadian by the name of Etta the Grasshopper Clark. I'm not making that name up. Fat Alice and the Grasshopper. I think I saw them open up for Trippin' Daisies back in '98. Anyway, these two madams weren't always enemies, by the way. Evidence suggests that they were friends at one point and maybe even lovers. But money is money, and you don't mess with another woman's money. And you damn sure don't go poaching their girls, which it seems Miss Clark did, even if it was inadvertently. And while I'm pretty sure this little tussle was a long time coming, for sure Clark and Abbott had a history, the actual violence was directly related to the Grasshopper stealing, or at least giving refuge to, one of Alice Abbott's top earners, a young lady named Bessie Colvin. And Bessie wasn't just one of Fat Alice's top earners, but she was one of the most popular girls in the entire damn Tenderloin district. As such, she could probably name her price, so it comes as no shock to learn that she and Alice began quarreling over money. By the way, there is a picture of Bessie online, and yeah, she was very pretty. It almost doesn't seem like a real picture from those days. It looks more like a modern-day model is posing and using some sort of Instagram filter. So just judging by that one photo, the idea that Bessie Colvin was very sought after certainly adds up. And maybe it got to her head, because apparently she stopped paying Alice the money she owed for rent. Story goes that Miss Colvin got some liquid courage in her and told Big Alice that she didn't owe her shit. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And then things escalated and Bessie finally had enough, bidding Alice adieu and sashaying her fine ass across the thoroughfare to Etta's joint, telling all who would listen that, quote, prime cut will soon be found across the street, end quote. Prime cut, of course, meaning her little poontang. You know, that's a good thing about being good at what you do. If you're an average employee, you're replaceable, or you might find it hard to get a new job somewhere else. But learn you a good skill, a good trade, and get really good at it, and you can take your skills elsewhere. Bessie knew she had that sweet poussée, that's French for pussy, and knew that it would be appreciated elsewhere. Only problem is, one doesn't simply just walk away from Big Alice Abbot. Now, if she's got anything to say about it. That's just not going to happen, okay? Alice don't play no shit, you hear me? Alice never been about that. Never been about playing no shit. Shout out to the other guys. I love that movie. All right, moving forward. Miss Alice promptly marched across that dusty street and began banging on the front door of Etta the Grasshopper's place. Opening the door just barely enough to look out, Etta told Alice to kick rocks and refused to let her angry rival come inside. Got to assume letting people come inside is an occupational hazard both Alice and Etta were familiar with, if you catch my drift. This refusal, however, didn't sit too well with Alice.
Using her massive or stout frame, she ripped the entire door off its hinges and came barreling in, smashing Eda's face in the process. Not exactly a wilting flower herself, and knowing full well you can't have a conscience in the pimp game, Eda Clark went for the nearest weapon she could find, a heavy brass gas lighter. Now, these old gas lighters, from what I can tell, they aren't tiny. They're long enough, about 2.5, 3 feet long, to light street lamps or high-up ceiling lights. Made of brass, they usually have a wooden handle and a valve key on the end for turning on gas, as well as a wick for lighting lamps. Not something you'd want to take into battle, but then again, it's not exactly something you'd want to get slapped upside the face with either. In the right hands, it would be possible to beat a man, or a plump madam, to death with such a contraption, which I'm sure is what Eda had in mind, swinging that brass lighter at Alice's large head with all she had. It was no use, though. Alice Abbot had her dander up. She deflected the blow and rammed her fist into Eda's mouth, sending the smaller madam tumbling to the ground. Alice then grabbed Eda by the wrist and began dragging her across the floor like a damn Swiffer wet jet. Finally, Eda mustered up enough strength to escape Abbot's clutches, fled to her quarters, quickly re-emerging with a bone-handled .44 Bulldog revolver. "Miss Alice, I want you to leave my house," Eda ordered, thumbing back the hammer. "Oh, I'll leave your house," was Alice's reply, as she did the exact opposite, started approaching Eda with a menacing look on her face, just seeming to disregard the pistol entirely. Now, by this time, Eda was done making threats. I guess she didn't play either. "I'll kill the damn bitch," she cried. Now, by the way, I'm not making this dialogue up. These are the reported words that they said to each other. "I'll kill the damn bitch," is what Eda said, right before she squeezed the trigger, sending a round straight into Alice's moneymaker. Yes, you heard me correctly. For a lack of better words, Eda shot Alice in the cooter. "My God, I'm shot," Abbot bellowed, staggering out of the cat house and collapsing on the street. Eda wasn't done, though, and aiming to finish things, she followed, firing 3 more rounds at Alice that luckily missed their mark. Now, that .44 slug that hit Alice struck her in something called the pubic arch, a medical term that a local paper would report either accidentally or tongue-in-cheek as her public arch, alluding to her occupation. Now, I didn't know what a pubic arch was, so I Googled it. Medically speaking, it's the notch formed by the inferior rami of the 2 conjoined pubic bones as they diverge from the midline. And that's according to Merriam-Webster, who I don't believe was a prostitute. But I still don't really know what a pubic arch means, so I kept looking. I'll try to sum it up for those of you like me without a damn medical degree. But here's what it is. Think about those fake skeletons we used to have back in school. Now imagine that pelvis bone region. The pubic arch is the very bottom of the pelvis bone. You know what? Better yet, just Google it, or trust me in saying that it's not exactly a fun place to get shot. Either way, once you understand what I'm talking about, you'll get why I say that Miss Abbott caught around right there in her coochie ya. Talk about a vaginal discharge. Luckily for her, the bullet passed on through without hitting any vitals. Although I suppose her little flower pot could be considered vital. Still, though, it wasn't much longer before she was back on her feet, and back, and knees, making that money. Eda Clark ended up turning herself into authorities and got slapped with attempted first-degree murder charges. Less than a month later, a jury would find her not guilty on grounds of self-defense. And while I agree she was definitely defending herself, I do wonder how many customers of hers were on that jury. As far as Alice goes, well, she may not have let bygones be bygones. Like I said, that paper, to her humiliation, referred to her pubic arch as her public arch. And she had to deal with the fact that Eda remained unpunished, right there across the street. And in my mind, at least, I imagine that Eda probably would have been taunting Alice. It does look like there is a chance that Alice got her revenge. And if she did, she waited 2 long years to do so. Finally, one dark night in the summer of 1888, Eda the Grasshopper's place got torched. Completely burned to the ground and reduced her and her ladies to plying their trade on the streets, right along with the crib girls. At least temporarily. Eventually a wealthier client came along and built her a new parlor. Now, obviously, I can't prove that it was Alice that set the building on fire. But I don't believe much in coincidences, and she certainly did have the motivation. Abbott would continue pimping in El Paso until 1890 before selling her cat house to another infamous madam, Tilly Howard.
And finally, on April 7th, 1896, Big Alice Abbot's heart gave out. She was likely only in her early 50s, and she was buried there in the Evergreen Cemetery. I'm not sure what happened to Bessie Colvin, the Helen of El Paso, if you will, other than that she did return to work for Big Alice after that shooting incident over at Etta's brothel, which leads me to believe that Alice's pimp hand was indeed strong. As for Etta, her place would burn down again in 1905. Already not doing all that well health-wise, inhaling all that smoke didn't much help matters. She herself would pass away a few years later in Atlanta in 1908 as a direct result of her lingering illness and the complications from that smoke inhalation. Now, the pictures we have of these ladies come from Alice Abbot's photo album, which is full of all kinds of interesting notes left by the madam herself. Apparently, she kept pictures of all her soiled doves, and many of them have the letter A surrounded by a heart drawn on them, a symbol that some think indicates the girls who also doubled as Alice's lovers. Other notes she scribbled in the album include nicknames such as the Missouri Whacker, Bitches of the Road, and one prostitute she dubbed Loverboy Mabel Jacobs. As far as the picture of Etta Clark goes, well, Alice marked a big red X over her and left a note that appears to read, quote, "whore to N-words," end quote. I'll let you figure that one out. You know, I don't know about you, but when I consider Old West prostitutes, it's very easy for me to slip into a fantastical frame of mind. Like, you ever seen Westworld on HBO? I mean, the women on there are sexy, right? But then I remind myself of how it really was. Nobody brushed their teeth, and I do mean nobody. In the early 1900s, only 7% of American households brushed their teeth or at least had toothpaste in their homes. During the First World War, most of the Army recruits had such poor oral hygiene that the military considered dental disease a national crisis. And that was nearly 40 years after Big Alice and Etta got in that fight. The women didn't shave their legs or anything else for that matter. Neither did the men. Nobody wore deodorant. And how often do you think these prostitutes bathed? Let's pretend it was once a day, which it for sure wasn't, but let's just say it was. How many men did they service in a day? Men who also weren't bathing on the regular. And this was El Paso. It gets hot there, like really hot. Even the stench of the most upscale parlor house in 1880 would be enough to make us modern day people gag. But I suppose it's what you're used to, right? As far as the actual historical town of El Paso goes, I did try to find out what now stands at 19 South Utah Street, where Fat Alice plied her trade. But I don't know what that location is in terms of present-day South Mesa. If it is 19 South Mesa, then it is just a fenced-in empty lot in front of a SK Cosmetics beauty supply building. We know that Alice sold her whorehouse to Tilly Howard. However, that place burned down. But Tilly's new brothel was just a block away at 214 South Mesa, which also appears to just be an open lot, right next to a beauty salon and a sporting goods store. Interestingly enough, that place at 214 South Mesa was the site of another famous Wild West incident in 1894 when a guy named Bass Outlaw, not to be confused with the outlaw Sam Bass, got himself shot to death by El Paso Constable John Selman. Constable Selman, of course, would go on to kill John Wesley Hardin just a year later at the Acme Saloon located on, you guessed it, what's now known as Mesa Street. Actually, the northwest corner of Mesa and San Antonio Avenue, which now appears to be, if I'm looking at this map correctly, an Al Rio toy store. And I believe, check me on this, but I believe this is the same corner that Dallas Studenmeyer had his famous 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight. And it's the same area where John Selman, who I just mentioned, himself was gunned down just 9 months after he gunned down John Wesley Hardin. Whew. Lots of killing and lots of history right there on El Paso's Mesa Street. And a whole lot of whoring. Remember that bulldog revolver I mentioned that Etta used to shoot Alice? Well, that's basically just a snub-nosed revolver. It's the same type of pistol that was used to assassinate U.S. President James Garfield in 1881. That one being chambered in .442. And I reckon that's about all I've got on Alice Abbot and Etta Clark. Shout out to the always valuable True West magazine for providing some good research fodder for this episode. I'll leave several links in this episode's show notes if you want further reading or you just like to see what these ladies look like. One more thing. I know I joke around a lot, especially on this episode, but my heart really does go out to these working women. I know it's a life that's often glamorized, but in reality, it's anything but. And glamorization aside, it's not something that very many people choose to do. The vast majority of the time, anyone prostituting themselves out is doing so from pure desperation. Whether it be addiction, extreme poverty, broken homes, under the threat of violence, or just a combination of all of the above. The lifestyle is not glamorous and it rarely ends well. Now, me personally, I do believe it should be decriminalized. I don't see the point in locking these women up, charging them with crimes, and making it even harder for them to get ahead and find legitimate work. You're just making a desperate situation much, much worse. At least if it was legal, maybe it could be more regulated, safer. Maybe it'd be easier for these abused women to go to authorities for help. I don't know. What do I know? I guess the thing to keep in mind is that these girls weren't always prostitutes. This is somebody's daughter, little sister that's being bought. My heart goes out to them. And all joking aside, there is no judgment in this episode of anybody that is stuck in that life. That the reality of prostitution is heartbreaking. I don't know how to fix it. I have no solutions other than just love your daughters. As the late great Billy Joe Shaver once sang, don't let the darkness take them. Don't make them feel forsaken. Just lead them safely to the light. All right, enough of that.
Yeehaw!
Back in the summer of 1874, the Comanche and their allies went on the offense. Turns out a bunch of uninvited buffalo hunters were invading their territory, and, well, they didn't much appreciate that. This turn of events would lead to the Second Battle of Adobe Walls and the Red River War, a conflict that saw Colonel Ronald McKenzie and the U.S. Army crisscrossing the Llano Estacado in order to finally defeat the Comanche for good. And they were successful, mostly due to McKenzie striking at their winter camp, destroying their lodges, along with their supply of winter food, and killing over 1,500 head of Comanche ponies. Without provisions or shelter for the winter, and especially without their lifeblood, the horses, these lords of the southern plains were, effectively, defeated. By June of 1875, Quanah Parker and the last of the holdouts surrendered at Fort Sill, and that was it. The Comanche were on the reservation, the buffalo were mostly gone, and all that prime real estate was free for the taking. While the legendary Charles Goodnight may have been one of the first to run cattle near the Palo Duro Canyon, other folks soon began putting down roots some 90-odd miles to the northwest at a place called Tascosa. First, just a small collection of New Mexican sheep herders. Weren't long before Tascosa began filling up with Texas cattlemen and ranchers hoping to claim their piece of all that wide open land. And they did so at breakneck speed, turning the tiny sheep town into the cowboy capital of the plains and an economic rival to Dodge City nearly overnight. Massive ranches like the LS, the LX, the Frying Pan, and even the storied XIT, which is still around today, by the way, all began running cows in the area as Tascosa became the hub of all cattle shipping and supplying in the Texas Panhandle. That being the case, Tascosa was about as wild of a town as you could hope to find back in its heyday, especially lower Tascosa, which soon came to be called Hogtown. That's where you could find all the brothels and the cheaper, seedier saloons. You may remember from the recent series on Billy the Kid about how the regulators called Tascosa home after the Lincoln County War. Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, and Dave Rudaball all walked the cowtown's dusty streets, as did other legendary Old West figures like John Selman, Henry Newton Brown, Pat Garrett, and Charlie Siringo, just to name a few. And then there were others, men perhaps you've never heard of, like Ed King or Poker Tom or Louis the Animal Boozman. And of course, we can't forget the Catfish Kid and Squirrel-Eyed Charlie. Sounds like a bunch of made-up names, I know, but what if I were to tell you that not only were they all very real citizens of Tascosa, but that they also participated in a shootout that eclipsed the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, both in shots fired and dead bodies? Oh yeah, today we're going to take a little trip up to the Panhandle and visit a town described by some as tougher than Tombstone, deadlier than Dodge, and as damnable as Deadwood. This tale has a little bit of everything. Double-crossing dance hall gals, an action-packed gunfight, Boot Hill, a ghost town, and hell, I'll even top it all off with a nice little Old West love story. My name's Josh, and you're listening to the Wild West Extravaganza. The
LS Ranch got its start in 1880 when an old boy from Kansas named Lucian Scott purchased over 35,000 acres in the newly settled Texas Panhandle. Not long thereafter, he went into business with cattleman William McDowell Lee, and by 1883, the ranch had nearly doubled in size. Everybody was making big money, and by everybody, I mean the large spreads like the LS. Investors from back east in Europe got involved, the smaller operations were squeezed out, and even the poor hard-working cowboys began feeling the burn. Not only were they stuck making a paltry sum of just $30 a month, but they were also barred from the age-old tradition of branded mavericks and taking partial payment in calves. The only real hope any of these youngsters had in building capital of their own. So they went on strike. According to newspapers at the time, between 200 to 300 Texas Panhandle cowboys, including them employed on the big ranches, all walked off the job shortly before the big spring roundup of 1883. They posted a list of demands, most of which were calling for a substantial raise in pay, and cautioned that anybody who ignored these stipulations would suffer the consequences. Oh my. Ultimately, the whole thing didn't amount to a hill of beans. The striking cowhands soon ran out of money and were forced to return back to their employers, 10-gallon hats in hand. Them that would take them back, that is. Many of the out-of-work cowboys soon found themselves blacklisted and unable to find work within several hundred miles. So some of them just took out their frustrations on their former bosses. Fences were cut, livestock was stolen, and pastures were burned. Hell, one group of out-of-work cowboys even took to calling themselves the Get Even Cattle Company. Now, how much of this rank thievery and mayhem truly occurred is somewhat contested, and the strike, as well as its aftermath, were largely blown out of proportion by the newspapers. That said, there was enough of a problem with stolen livestock for the big spreads, namely the LS, to bring in some outside help. And who better to call than the former sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico himself, Pat Garrett. Still high off his reputation as being the man who killed Billy the Kid, Garrett signed on at $5,000 a year, over $150,000 in today's money, and formed what was called the Home Rangers. Now, I'm not certain how official this group was. Legend has it that Pat Garrett received a commission from then Texas Governor John Ireland, but no such record has yet to be discovered. So whether or not they were officially official, or this was just sort of a wink and nod type of deal, either way, I'm pretty positive that Garrett and the LS Ranch had the full approval of the Texas government. With that in mind, I do think it's important to point out that these guys were not Texas Rangers, despite using the name Ranger in their title. According to historian Leon Metz, many of the smaller ranchers and homesteaders, thinking that these developments were just a way for the big cattlemen to take over the entire country, started to sneeringly refer to Garrett's outfit as the LS Rangers. And they might have been onto something, as the Rangers' ranks were packed with LS employees, some of whom coincidentally had been with Garrett over at Stinking Springs when he arrested Billy Bonney and Rudaball and them others. Hell, Jim East, the sheriff of Oldham County, where Tascosa is located, was also a former deputy of Garrett's, and he flat out warned Pat about these new recruits, saying that he didn't want nothing to do with them. And I reckon Pat, to his credit, soon came to the same conclusion. Garrett quickly caught on to the fact that he was basically being paid to kill folks for the big outfit, as opposed to bringing them to trial, so he simply handed in his papers and the LS Rangers were disbanded. But they didn't just go away. Like I said earlier, most of them worked for the LS Ranch, and they continued to do so even after Garrett's departure. And even though they were no longer officially quote-unquote Rangers, that didn't stop them from trying to throw their weight around. And oh boy, throw it around did they, albeit mostly in Tascosa's various saloons and gambling establishments. So much so, in fact, that they soon earned themselves yet another nickname, the Barroom Gladiators. And, well, let's just say not everybody was a fan. Especially not Tascosa bartender Lem Woodruff, who had the misfortune of being one of the victims of barroom gladiator leader Ed King. Now, I found several references to Ed King being an ex-Texas Ranger, but once again, I'm not sure how true that is. I think this probably just alludes to King's time as an LS Ranger under Pat Garrett, but I could be wrong. One story I found, straight from a Tascosa old-timer, stated that while Ed did indeed have at least one notch on his gun, he was mostly just a hard-working cowboy who earned an honest living. Problem was, when King got all liquored up, he was, quote, easy on the draw, and didn't mind going on the offense. And not only had King recently stolen the aforementioned Lem Woodruff's girlfriend, a dance hall gal by the name of Sally Emery, but he also took to openly mocking the bartender, calling him Pretty Lem, slapping him on the face, and get this, even forcing Woodruff to call him daddy. Woo! There's only so much abuse a man's willing to take, though, right? And I'm pretty sure being forced to call another grown man daddy is getting right to that tipping point. And sure enough, Lem Woodruff was about to teach Ed King a lesson in manners that he wouldn't live long enough to forget. And it all came to a head in the still dark early morning hours of March 21st, 1886. Ed King and a few of his buddies, Johnny Lang, Frank Valli, and Fred Chilton, had themselves a real good time over at Hogtown before headed back into Tascosa proper at around 2 a.m. They tied their ponies up at the Equity Bar and began to head inside. All of them except for Ed King, that is. Little Miss Sally Emery had just finished her shift over at Jenkins Saloon, and the two were headed back to her place for a little early morning rendezvous. As it turns out, Ed wouldn't make it. Right about the time that Chilton, Lang, and Valley were disappearing inside the Equity, somebody held King from the shadows. Stepping forward to investigate, Ed was rewarded by a bullet slamming square into his face. He falls to the dirt, Sally Emery screams and takes off running, and sure enough, here comes Lem Woodruff, emerging from the darkness with a smoking Winchester in his hands. Seeing King struggling to breathe, Lem levels the rifle once more and, at nearly point-blank range, squeezes the trigger, forever putting an end to King's days of slapping bartenders. Now remember, the ex-Rangers' buddies are right across the street over at the Equity. They come spilling out in time to see Woodruff hightailing it towards Jenkins Saloon and give chase. Not seeing anybody out front, they then beat feet around back, only to run smack dab into the man they was a-hunting, Lem Woodruff. Only thing is, now he's got friends as well. Poker Tom Emery and his brother Squirrel-Eyed Charlie, Louis the Animal Boozman, and the awesomely named Catfish Kid. There weren't no love lost between this bunch and them barroom gladiators, to say the least, and gunfire erupted instantaneously. Despite both Woodruff and Squirrel-Eyed Charlie being on the receiving end of bullets, this fight would be an unmitigated disaster for Ed King's would-be avengers. Frank Valli was the first to fall, and depending on the source, he was either shot between the eyes and dropped dead on the spot, or he took a bullet through the nose, of all places, and lingered painfully for about an hour before finally cashing in his chips. Either way, he was out of the fight right at the get-go, and his companion, Fred Chilton, didn't last much longer himself, taking several rounds through the torso as he lurches to his knees, feebly handing his revolver off to the last man standing, Johnny Lang. And I think it's safe to say that at this point, Lang, now outnumbered 5-1, needed all the firepower he could muster. Shooting as he ran, Johnny retreated for cover with the bullets kicking up dust all around him as he finally made it out of the kill zone and back to the Equity Bar. It was there that he found Sheriff Jim East and his deputy Charlie Pierce, who were likely wondering what in the living hell had just popped off a block away. They accompany Lang back to the Jenkins Saloon, where they see somebody hop up from behind a woodpile and try to make a run for it. 3 pistols bark in unison, and the Catfish Kid falls to the ground, writhing and moaning in pain. Johnny Lang and the 2 lawmen press forward, looking for the others, but by this point they had already made their getaway. And a few moments later, so did the slippery Catfish Kid. Turns out he weren't hit at all and just sort of instinctively dropped at the sound of those guns and played possum as the lawmen passed him by. As soon as they turned their backs, he was gone as well. And thus ended what's now known as the big fight at Jenkins Saloon. Like I said, Squirrel-Eyed Charlie and Lem Woodruff were wounded, but they would ultimately pull through. Johnny Lang never received a scratch, but all 3 of his buddies, Ed King, Frank Valli, and Fred Chilton, were buried at Tascosa's Boot Hill the following day. Hey, real quick, let's hear from this episode's sponsors. All right, welcome back. Now, despite Woodruff and them others escaping into the night, they would all soon be arrested and charged with murder. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, and the second saw all 5 acquitted. And for the most part, they all stayed out of trouble for the rest of their lives, at least as far as I could find. Except, of course, for the Catfish Kid. I mean, with a name like that, it's hard not to get into trouble, right? Now, obviously, that wasn't his real name. It was John Go, and he was, by all accounts, a troublemaker of the first order. Shortly after the gunfight at Jenkins Saloon, Catfish would gun down an unarmed man and be sent to prison, where he died in the year 1890, ironically after choking on a catfish bone. Squirrel-Eyed Charlie Emery would be next, passing away in 1897. By the way, that wasn't his real name either. It was apparently Charles Arnhem. And his brother, Poker Tom, was Oscar Arnhem. And old Oscar would follow Charlie to the grave in 1914. I was unable to determine a cause of death for either man. Lem Woodruff ended up moving to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where I assume he refused to call anybody else daddy, and passed away in the year of our Lord 1902. Lewis the Animal Boozman lived quite a long life, making it all the way to January of 1942 before giving up the ghost in Oklahoma at the age of 83. Interestingly enough, Lewis Boozman also once rode with Pat Garrett. He was one of the men who helped kill Tom O'Folliard, and it was he and Jim East who carried Charlie Bowdry's dead body back to Bowdry's widow, Manuela. And surviving all of them would be Johnny Lang. He'd go on to become a marshal in Amarillo, take part in the Klondike Gold Rush in Alaska and Canada, serve in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, and even get involved in politics as the mayor of Haines, Oregon, before finally crossing that veil on April 4th, 1942. And by the way, I was joking about the catfish kid choking on a fish bone. He really did die in prison in 1890, but it was due to tuberculosis. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about that dance hall girl, Sally Emery, a.k.a. the Helen of Tascosa? Well, despite her yelling and running away as her boyfriend Ed King was murdered, Sally was most certainly no wilting flower. A few years prior to the big fight, a cowboy by the name of Bill Gibson, once again an alias, his real name was Frank Norwood, rode into Hogtown looking to spend some of his hard-earned money on whiskey, women, and fun. Bartender John Malley happened to notice the cowpoke flashing money around, so he sent in Sally Emery to soften the mark up. Sally lured Gibson back to her crib, and once the poor bastard was in a post-coital slumber, here comes John Malley, creeping in, killing Frank Norwood, and stealing all his money. A few months later, the victim's brother, Ed Norwood, rides into town and likewise begins flashing money around. And he too was seduced by Sally Emery, or so it seemed. Truth be told, Ed knew exactly what had happened to his brother, and he was planning on exacting some good old-fashioned revenge. Norwood laid there in Sally's bed for hours, pretended to be drunk, as he waited for John Malley to arrive. Finally, weary of waiting on the bartender, Ed just got up out of Sally's bed, sashayed on over to the dance hall, and put a bullet straight into Malley's chest, right in front of everybody. And thus another addition was added to Boot Hill. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out any more on Sally Emery. I have no idea what her origin story was or whatever became of her. Apparently, Sally just faded away into history, much like the town of Tascosa itself. First, the railroad passed them by, causing many of the citizens to pack up and move. And then, in the winter of 1886 and 87, you had a cattle-killing blizzard known as the Big Die-Up, which bankrupted many of the area ranchers. Today, although home to an organization for at-risk youth, not much remains of old Tascosa. You can still visit the courthouse, which is now the Blevins Museum, and there's even some remnants left of the old stone sheep pens built by Tascosa's very first inhabitants. And yes, you can visit Boot Hill, where the graves of Ed King and his pals are still plainly visible, as are many of the dozens of others who came to a premature end there at the cowboy capital of the plains. And dead though the town may have been by the turn of the century, the same could not be said for the love between a gambler and a certain dance hall gal with a heart of gold by the name of Frenchie McCormick. Not her real name, but at this point, who the hell's keeping tabs? Now, Frenchie first came west as a teenager and fell in love with a gambler by the name of Mickey McCormick in some smoky old saloon over in Mobeetie. The two lovebirds migrated further west to Tascosa and began working in the various saloons and gambling joints of Hogtown, where, according to Mickey, he always won at cards when Frenchie was by his side. They both lived there in Tascosa during its wild days. They both knew Billy the Kid. They were there during the big shootout, and they were both there when the railroad bypassed the town and its eventual decline. And although Tascosa began to crumble, their love for each other did not. The gambler, Mickey McCormick, died there in 1912, and once everybody else finally left town, Frenchie stayed on, by herself. Said she couldn't bear to be too far away from her man. For over 27 years, Frenchie McCormick remained in Tascosa, all alone. No running water, no electricity. Until 1939, with failing health, she finally allowed herself to be moved under one condition, that after her death, she be brought back and buried right next to Mickey. And she was. After passing away in 1941, somewhere around the age of 90, Frenchie and Mickey were reunited once again. And I guess that's about all I've got on Tascosa and the big fight at Jenkins Saloon.